Okay, Cecily, you're on.
All right, thank you. Thanks so much. Thank James and thanks to you all for tuning in, both sort of live and online. I'm really grateful for the chance to speak with you, especially since I had to reschedule, which I know is a real pain in the neck. Um, I was interviewing for a job at the University of Wyoming when I had to reschedule, and fortunately it worked out and I got the job. So I'm now in the process of preparing to leave Dallas and moved to Wyoming, which is a lot closer to home. And I think a place that Mo will enjoy much more. Also, a place that's really relevant to my work, to the book I'm going to talk to you about tonight, and to my kind of journey as a historian. I already said I can't compete with Zach Fry's visuals, but I know he's spoken to you recently. But if you'll give me a break, I'll try to do my best here and tell you a little bit about this book, which was my first book, derived from a dissertation that I wrote at Penn State, where I did my graduate work. I'm a Westerner by birth and up sort of and was brought up in Colorado, and spent most of my childhood traveling between northern Colorado, where I grew up, across Wyoming and South Dakota, to this place in North Dakota. This is Fort Abraham Lincoln, now a state park managed by the state of North Dakota, near present-day Mandan, which is on the west side of the Missouri River, across from the state capital, Bismarck. Fort Abraham Lincoln was completed in 1872 to allow the Army to protect the Northern Pacific Railroad as it was being surveyed and built out to the Pacific coast. And it was famously home to the 7th Cavalry. They were the first regiment to be posted to the fort. And of course, their leader was George Custer, who has a Michigan connection. He and his wife, Libby, lived at the fort and along with most of the regiment. And it is from Fort Lincoln that Custer leaves to go on the Little Bighorn expedition in the summer of 1876, an expedition, of course, from which he does not return. The picture there is me and my two grandparents. These are my dad's parents, John and Ida Zander. They were the children of immigrants from what is now Ukraine. So, what was then a sort of mix of German and Russian in the late 19th century, whose families settled on the North Dakota prairie. And every summer, when we would go to visit them, we would visit Fort Lincoln, where they often had really vivid living history demonstrations, people you could talk to dressed in 19th century military uniforms, answering questions according to the language of the period, informed by the history of the place. And it really captured my imagination. And I went to college at the University of Virginia, where, of course, there's a keen interest in the American Civil War. There was an 8 a.m. Tuesday, Thursday course in Civil War history, my first year at UVA. And because freshmen register so late, it was one of the few courses left open. I thought I would give it a shot because I knew all of these guys who had served in the Civil War from what they had done in the West after the conflict. And I wanted to understand what they'd been up to before that. And that really began my journey. And when it came time for me to choose a topic to write a book about, write a dissertation about, it seemed to be a natural choice in my mind to combine that history of the American West, which I had grown up reading about and learning about very vividly, and that history of the Civil War that had captured my academic attention. And so that's how I kind of came to this project. It was a real joy to get to study this period and to think about some of the problems that are related to the kind of question of what did the professional army do during the American Civil War era, and what was their kind of role in helping the nation expand into the West in the same period. So, when I talk about this book, uh, I usually emphasize three themes that I think are kind of most important in what I wrote about, what I found. And so I really wanted to understand why, in the history of the American Civil War, when you read books about the conflict, they talk about how much more powerful the army became as a result of the war, they talk about how many important sort of figures like Philip Sheridan and William Tecumseh Sherman took what they learned in the Civil War and then applied it in the West after the conflict. You read about this from the Civil War side. But when you go to these sites in the West, as I had grown up doing, what you hear is that army life on the American frontier was miserable. It was isolated. It was lonely. Soldiers were not cared for. They were not cared for by their officers. They were not cared for by the tasks that were set for them by the American nation state. And I wanted to figure out why there's such a difference in the way that this institution, the professional army of the United States, that is, those men who made soldiering their profession, they were professional soldiers, why they are treated so differently in these two kind of streams of historical thought. And the answer that I arrived at had everything to do with the rise of the Republican Party, which came to power, of course, as you all know, at the outset of the American Civil War, and then dominated American politics for the better part of 16 years, from 1860 to about 1876, the end of Reconstruction. And what I found is that the reason the Army was treated so differently than any other institution is that the Republican Party was not simply an anti-slavery party. This is what we know them as. We know them as the party that was opposed to the expansion of slavery. They were also an anti-army party. So they associated, in particular, the professional army of the antebellum period, that is the period before the Civil War, with slavery expansion. And when the Republican Party came to power, led by President Abraham Lincoln, they made it their mission to punish the pro-slavery element in the country, and that meant in part punishing the army as well. The second key thing to take away from this book and from my research is that Republican anti-militarism really had a powerful effect on how the Army could perform its jobs, and in particular, its effectiveness, as I say here, in facilitating Western expansion after the Civil War. I focus in the book on a few places, but the Great Plains, that huge chunk of Wyoming and the Dakotas in particular, was a key part of where this struggle played out. And finally, that by devaluing the professional army to the extent that they did, Republicans encouraged extra legal violence in the West. And this had disastrous consequences for indigenous people. And so this final point is really important when we think about where historians are trying to push our attention in the national conversation. There's been a lot of conversation among historians recently about how to categorize the tragedy of what happened to indigenous peoples in the American West after the Civil War during the so-called Indian Wars. I argue in my book that while the Army obviously played a role in this, it was violence perpetrated by civilians and, in particular, extra-legal militias who were trying to take the place of the Army, which could not meet the demands that it was sort of required to meet, and that this extra-legal violence, this militia violence, was really an engine of the destruction of indigenous culture and indigenous lives after the Civil War. So I'm going to talk about kind of all of those things, see if I can convince you of whether or not I'm right. But I'll be glad to answer questions at the end as well. I can also talk a little bit about what this meant for Reconstruction. The book bit off quite a big chunk of Civil War, what we call historiography. I make some arguments about Reconstruction in addition to Western expansion, but I think I decided tonight to emphasize the Western expansion angle. I think it's potentially the more interesting and compelling one, though the Reconstruction questions are interesting as well. I'll start you with two definitions. I've already kind of given you one of them. That is the regular army, which is the body of soldiers and officers, usually trained at West Point, who undertook military service as their career. So you have one regular Army officer on the screen here, through and through. That is William Tecumseh Sherman, educated at West Point, graduated into military service. He did leave the army in the 1850s, but when he came back during the Civil War, and then after when he became general in chief of the army during the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, his great friend and Civil War ally, he was a professional soldier and he oversaw the regular army. The fellow on the other side of the screen from Sherman is Nelson Miles, who also served as general in chief of the regular army after the Civil War, but he came from civilian life. He was not West Point educated. He had volunteered at the outset of the Civil War and risen through the ranks as a civilian soldier, and then chose to stay in the army after the conflict, continued his rise through service. But he was a civilian who became a professional soldier. Sherman was a professional soldier through and through, though they both served the regular army. The distinction is important because Republicans will really like one of these two gentlemen and they'll really resent one of them. They love Nelson Miles because Nelson Miles is everything a soldier in a democratic republic should be, a volunteer who rose to meet the call of his country and then continued in patriotic service. Sherman was an aristocrat who had been educated at an aristocratic institution at West Point, who believed he should be in charge of other men, who was viewed as a martinet and something of a tyrant. Professional soldiers were extremely disliked. Civilian volunteers were the pride and joy of the Republican Party. And I'll continue to talk about those distinctions as we go through the remainder of the presentation. The second very important definition is important in part because 19th century Americans didn't have a language of anti-militarism. They didn't call their politics an anti-militaristic politics. They simply considered it part and parcel of their broader Republican ideology. So I call it anti-militarism in the book as a shorthand for describing the Republican attitude of opposition toward giving professional soldiers too much power, whether that be political or economic. And so the key ways in which the Republican Party is going to kind of voice or demonstrate their opposition to the regular army is through funding cuts, cuts to the number of soldiers within the army, and with political reprimands for what the army is doing at any given moment. But we really need to understand why the Republican Party felt this way to begin with. And for that, we have to go back to this map. And if you all were students in my U.S. history survey class, you'd be rolling your eyes at this point because you'd have seen this map 15 times by the time we got to the Civil War. But that's because the Republican Party arises from the crisis in Kansas, one of the single most important kind of events in American history, this crucible moment for changing the national tide in terms of politics, in terms of opposition to slavery's expansion, and for empowering a coalition of the collapsed Whig Party, disaffected Northern Democrats who no longer believed in slavery to the extent their Southern colleagues did, know-nothings and nationalists, isolationists. They all come together in response to the crisis in Kansas. And from this crucible, the Republican Party emerges as a viable political entity. They will run their first presidential candidate in 1856 in John C. Fremont. He will not win. He will lose to James Buchanan, Pennsylvania's only president, and a sad record that is for the state of Pennsylvania, where I once lived. But Abraham Lincoln in 1860 will run as the Republican candidate. He will be the first Republican elected to the presidency. And his inauguration will usher in, as I've already said, about 15 years of Republican domination within national politics. So let's take a step out and just recall what the crisis in Kansas was all about. So this white kind of section of territory in the middle of the country is what is now mainly Kansas. Some of that was given over to Colorado, thank goodness, in a stroke of good fortune for the people of my home state. So Kansas wants to come into the Union in the mid 1850s. It's been a territory It's gotten all of its sort of paperwork together. It's ready to apply for statehood. But there's a problem. Is slavery as an institution going to be allowed in this new state of Kansas? So the federal government kind of puts its heads together and led by Stephen Douglas, the little giant of the Senate, they decide to leave the question open to the citizens of the territory. This plan, this idea is known as popular sovereignty. The vote over whether slavery will expand into Kansas devolves into chaos. People rush the border from north, south, east, and west. More people voted in the election than actually lived in the territory. And at the end of the day, two different governments claim to be the legitimate government of Kansas. The pro-slavery government in Lecompton, the anti-slavery government in Topeka, and it is left up to the President of the United States to decide which government to recognize as the legitimate government of the territory. At the time all of this is happening, at the time the question of who is going to govern Kansas is swirling in the national politics, the president is Franklin Pierce, a northern man with southern principles, what we call a doughface. Though he was not a slaveholder himself, he supported slaveholding ideology. And perhaps more importantly, his Secretary of War, who had enormous influence over Pierce, a Mississippian by the name of Jefferson Davis, another West Point graduate, a professional soldier who had taken a keen interest in leveraging his role as Secretary of War in charge of the regular army to facilitate slavery's expansion into the American West. And so Pierce and Davis concoct a plan. They're going to recognize the pro-slavery government at Lecompton, and they are going to forcibly dissemble the anti-slavery government at Topeka. And they're going to do that by sending a regiment of the regular Army of the United States under the command of Edwin Vose Sumner, who will go on to be the oldest field grade officer to serve in the American Civil War, to Topeka on the 4th of July, with orders to disperse a meeting of the Free State Legislature by force if necessary. Sumner, whose cousin is Charles Sumner, the radical abolitionist senator from Massachusetts, is a little bit iffy about whether he should do this. But he has orders from the Secretary of War. He has his regiment. He marches to Topeka. He stations his cannon outside the legislative hall, and he orders the meeting to disperse. The Free State men of Topeka, being fairly rational, know that this is unconstitutional. They're holding a legitimate meeting, voicing their constitutional rights to free speech and freedom of assembly. But Sumner and his regiment of U.S. soldiers have a bunch of guns, and he's telling them to leave, and so they do. As Sumner rides away from the scene, a reporter from the New York Herald pulls him aside and says, "Colonel, you have robbed Oliver Cromwell of his laurels." The regular army has been pulled into the crisis in Kansas. They have been made an accessory to slavery's expansion. And when Charles Sumner, the cousin of Edwin Vose Sumner, gives his speech about the crisis in Kansas just over a year later, he fixates on the professional army's role in this crisis. And so the regular army's part in helping slavery expand into the American West becomes associated with this evolving and developing Republican ideology. From the very beginning, prominent Republicans such as Sumner and William Henry Seward believe that the professional army is the greatest instrument the American South had for expanding slavery. And so to be anti-slavery, to be opposed to slavery's expansion, necessitates being opposed to the regular army and any attempt to strengthen or expand that institution. For Republicans, these two issues are completely bound up together. And that's going to be a problem because the Republican Party, as I've said now a few times, is going to be in charge of this little crisis known as the American Civil War, and then the reconstruction of the country and its aftermath. Those are events that are going to require, unfortunately for the Republicans, extensive military involvement. And so you're going to have a party in power running the country that is extremely reluctant to empower the instrument it needs the most to help win their civil war and to help rebuild the country in its aftermath. But here's the best way I can give you an idea of how Republicans rhetorically, politically, economically began to bind up the issue of the professional army and slavery's expansion. And there's perhaps no better spokesman for this than William Henry Seward, who was the presumptive, really, Republican nominee for the presidency in 1860 before he was deemed too radical by the Republican mainstream, and Lincoln pipped him to the nomination in Chicago. But Seward, more than perhaps any other Republican, was responsible for articulating what the party believed. And here's what he said in reference to the crisis in Kansas. He said that he would grant, for the sake of argument, that with federal battalions, that is, professional troops, you can carry slavery into Kansas and maintain it there. But he gives a warning. You will then yourselves have introduced the Trojan horse. No Republican government ever has endured withstanding armies maintained in its bosom to enforce submission to its laws. A people who have once learned to relinquish their rights under compulsion will not be long in forgetting they ever had any. Seward is saying, point blank, if you let the professional army be used in this way, then you are going to rob people of their liberties. It is incompatible with republicanism, that is, lowercase r republicanism. It is incompatible with democracy. You cannot empower the professional army in this way. It is the reason for this crisis. It is the reason the Republican Party needs to start to check the power of this institution. And they will carry that forward into the Civil War. So in 1860, Abraham Lincoln wins the Republican nomination and then wins election to the presidency. He does not appear on the ballot in a single Southern state. He doesn't need their electoral votes. It's no problem. Lincoln's election triggers a crisis. The secession winter, 7 Confederate states in the lower South secede, and Lincoln waits to see what the upper South states will do in their wake. It looks like war is coming, and after Fort Sumter and Lincoln's attempt to resupply Robert Anderson and the small federal garrison in Charleston Harbor, the 4 upper South states join the lower South in their secession movement, and war is inaugurated. Lincoln has to call for volunteers, but he also needs to rely on the professional army to basically provide the backbone of what will become a massive volunteer military effort. So about 2.1 million men will don a blue uniform in the American Civil War. About 900,000 men will don a gray Confederate uniform. So 2.1 million U.S. soldiers, volunteers through and through. The professional army in total by the end of the Civil War. So they raised 2.1 million troops to fight. And the professional army, which began the war at the size of 16,000 men, that is 16 regiments, will grow to the grand total of 25,000 men, or 25 regiments. Only 9 regiments are added to the professional army during the Civil War. More than 2,000 volunteer regiments will be recruited over the course of the conflict. I think that statistic is as telling as any to understand how the Republicans intended to keep the professional army out of the real business of war making. The one place where they couldn't avoid professional soldiers was amongst the officer corps, because they did need men with military experience to command their armies. But that didn't mean they liked it. And it's really important to give some context as to why this is. Even though the Republicans, again, here are showing some lack of familiarity with statistics. There are about 1,200 officers in the regular professional officer corps prior to the American Civil War. About 300 of those officers leave, they resign their commissions, and they join the Confederacy. So that's about 1 in 4. And yet you would think that the entire officer corps of the professional army had left. By the way, Republicans talk about the extent to which they are actually willing to trust West Point trained officers to fight and win in the Civil War. And they come up with a variety of ways in which to meddle with the ability of these professional soldiers to get their jobs done. Zachariah Chandler, of course, the radical Michigan representative. So many of you probably know him. I will say my students are always horrified when I show his picture. They do not understand how his hair is growing that way or why he would choose to grow it that way. And I say it's not their problem, but they're still extremely upset about it. He put it this way, and I want to say Chandler didn't mince words. And I also always like to remind students, if you think that political rhetoric is really charged today, it was just as charged in the 19th century. Chandler said this about West Point in the wake of the resignation of those 300 or so future Confederate officers. He said that the West Point Academy has produced more traitors than all the institutions of learning and education that have existed since Judas Iscariot's time. So it was a very calm and reasoned assessment, right? But he was trying to make a point. He was trying to say that West Point men cannot be trusted. And he was not alone in espousing this ideology. Another senator from Ohio, a man by the name of John Sherman, frequently stood up in front of the Senate decrying the abilities of West Point trained officers. He's one of the first Republican senators to make a speech proposing that West Point officers be kept out of high-level military planning during the war. I'm sure this edified his older brother, William Tecumseh Sherman. You literally had men whose family members were fighting on battlefields to win the war, saying that they didn't believe that professional soldiers, that West Point officers had what it took to win the war. And so Republicans start to meddle, and they do so most famously in establishing the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, which is a joint congressional committee, so members of the House, members of the Senate. They haul up any general they would like to interview, and they put them to extensive questioning over the course of a couple days, which no general has to spare in the middle of the Civil War. George McClellan, who loved to complained vociferously that this committee wasted more of his time than any other institution he interacted with as general of the Army of the Potomac. They wanted to backseat general the Civil War. The Republicans wanted to tell West Point officers what to do, especially if those officers were viewed as conservative in any way. That is, conservative with a lowercase c. They wanted aggression. They wanted civilians in charge. They loved John Logan. They hated William Tecumseh Sherman. They loved a volunteer officer. They hated a professional officer. And they intended to have it on the record that they did not trust professional officers to win the war. The fact of the matter was, there was nothing they could do about it. The best officers the United States had, the ones it needed to rely on, were professional soldiers. And therefore, it was men like Philip Sheridan and William Tecumseh Sherman and Ulysses S. Grant that helped the United States to victory during the war. But it didn't stop the Joint Committee, who would haul up officers and demand their testimony in answer to all kinds of questions. I like to highlight this example before moving on to the postbellum period, because this is after the war is over. They're hauling in William Tecumseh Sherman to ask him why he handled the surrender of Joseph Johnston's army in Durham Station the way he did earlier in May 1865. They wanted to know in particular why Sherman did not negotiate the freedom of individuals living in parts of the Confederacy that the Union Army had not yet reached. They were upset that William Tecumseh Sherman had not tried to bring about or guarantee freedom for individuals still living in slavery at the end of the Civil War. So they asked him about it. In your agreement, there's nothing said about slavery. They wanted to turn the army into a political instrument of their own ambitions in the way that their Southern Democratic rivals had done before the Civil War. And they don't like Sherman's answer because Sherman says that's not my job. I'm a professional soldier. I'm not a politician. And I'm not going to play your games. It's not within my remit to bring about any sort of solution to the problem of slavery, any of the problems that come with giving freedom to 4 million enslaved people. That's your job, not mine, and you can't make me do it. And so they have more evidence, even though Sherman is totally right on this score. It's not his job. He's a professional soldier, of the professional army's unwillingness to play ball. And so they look to the future and they look at the job that they have to undertake. That job is multifaceted. They need to bring 11 former Confederate states back into the Union. That's going to require military intervention, especially to protect those 4 million newly freed people. And they also need to resume the traditional kind of processes of Western expansion that had gone on before the Civil War, that had been facilitated by the Army, but were now being done in the Republican image of free labor, of homesteads, of railroads, and of the possibility for any American to move west and gain land and grow up with the country. But they fumble this pretty massively. And I think we can see it best in a series of small battles that become known between 1866 and 1868 as Red Cloud's War. I teach my students about Red Cloud's War because it demonstrates how the Republican reluctance to rely on the professional army, to actually trust them with the funding and manpower they needed to operate at their highest capacity, uh, signaled disaster for the Republican Western Development Project, if you will. This is an image of what was known at the time as the Fetterman Massacre. It is now sort of called by historians the Fetterman Fight. It happens in 1866 in what is now Wyoming, along the spine of the Bighorn Mountains, along what was called the Bozeman Trail. So in 1864, gold is discovered in Montana. It's the third major gold strike in the American West after California and Colorado. And gold seekers begin moving to Montana in huge numbers at the end of the American Civil War. They're blazing a trail across the traditional domain, the lands of the Sioux, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho, who had been made victims of John Chivington at Sand Creek in 1864, and who were reluctant and disappointed to see even greater numbers of white settlers traversing their territory. In 1866, they decide to rise up against these settlers, this settlement process, and they do so by targeting the professional army. The Republicans had established three makeshift military forts along those Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming, and they had severely undermanned them. There were only about 65 men at each of the forts. That's less than a full company of soldiers. They were poorly funded. They weren't even regularly trained. A group of Sioux, under the command of a young warrior named Crazy Horse, decides to ride out near what was called Fort Philip Kearny and create a distraction. In response, a company under the command of an officer named William J. Fetterman rides out to see what's going on. They pass around a corner, they ride into a ravine out of sight of the fort and are fallen upon by several hundred Sioux warriors, and the entire command is massacred. It is one of the greatest moments of victory for indigenous people in the period of the so-called Indian War, and it is made possible because these soldiers were given no chance of succeeding by the Republican Party in charge, the Republican Party that was relying on them to do all that they could with almost no resources to protect these settlers. And instead, the army is sacrificed in this kind of effort at expansion and progress. Red Cloud's War is one of the most successful ever waged by an indigenous army, if you will, against the United States. It culminates in 1868 in a treaty at Fort Laramie, also in present-day Wyoming, what was then Dakota Territory. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, which is negotiated by Republican leaders and high-ranking professional officers such as William T. Sherman there in the middle. There's also Christopher Columbus Auger with his very great kind of whiskers, is one of the most favorable ever negotiated to Native people in American history. Not only does the Army have to cede huge amounts of territory, what is today most of the Black Hills of South Dakota, to the Sioux, they actually say point blank, we don't have the resources or the manpower or the money, and we don't foresee being given those things. So not only are we going to cede you this territory, we are going to abandon our forts and military installations in the Dakota Territory. We cannot maintain them in the face of indigenous resistance. The Republican Party, the federal government, which funds our operations, which sets our manpower numbers, which gives us the troops with which to do our work, is not doing it. And therefore, we have to give up these installations. It's amazing how politics dictated the outcome of this treaty, of this conflict. The Republican Party was simply unwilling to empower the regular army to the extent the army needed to be able to protect these settlers as they moved west. And therefore, they have to give up a huge amount. These forts are burned to the ground, they're abandoned. And the army's progress in Western expansion is set back for something like a decade. All because of politics, all because of this Republican resentment. I love this photograph. One of my favorites in the kind of history of American Western expansion. It's very evocative. And this treaty, very favorable to the Sioux. So I conclude here with this slide. Some of these films will be familiar to you, perhaps some of them less so. Why I wrote my book in another way. Why are we unaware? We've had 160 or so odd years since the end of the Civil War. We're just about at 160 years since Appomattox. Why were we so unaware? Why had nobody ever come across this idea of Republican anti-militarism, of this great opposition to the professional army? And I think the answer has a good deal to do with culture and with the way that the army has been portrayed in American memory. We don't think about the army being degraded or opposed or less powerful because in our media, in the films and TV shows we watch, and the novels we read, professional soldiers are the stars. They are the key proponents, the key movers, the key players in Western expansion. And this screen shows movies of two varieties. One in which, as in They Died with Their Boots On or Fort Apache, uh, the army is the hero. But also in films like Dances with Wolves and Soldier Blue and Hostile that critique the army. Either way, Americans will come away with one idea about Western expansion. That is, professional soldiers were integral to it and that they were very competent and capable, to the point that they made victims of every group that they encountered. I argue in my book that the history is quite different. If we take away this cultural facade, what we actually see is that the army did much of this work, and I'm not here to say that they didn't, in the face of significant political opposition. And it's an important story. It's important to understand because it is deeply relevant to understanding America as a nation and how it developed, and how the tension between a professional army and a democratic republic has long defined the way our country has developed and functioned. I think it's a really critical part of the story. I hope I've convinced you, at least in some way, that this Republican anti-militarism was not only present, but extremely important in how the process of Western expansion played out after the Civil War. I'm happy to take your questions now, see if I can get Mo over as well. But I appreciate the attention, appreciate the invitation again, and look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Cecily. That was great. Now, let me first turn off the recording. Where is the record button? Oh, stop.